Just a quick comment to finish off. Sorry, I've rubbed the middle cross chart one off. One of the concerns if we spend a lot of time talking about sin is that it is possible for us to misunderstand the importance and the glory of the gospel in the sense of the cross. The course that this diagram comes from asked us to pray three things for ourselves as we were coming to the course. One, that God would show us our sin. Two, that we would know the love of God. And three, that the cross would come alive. Those are good things to pray. But the only point that I want to make at this stage is one look at sin and a look at the love of God and the cross. So the percentages, we need to be careful that we don't spend all our time navel-gazing, all our time looking at sin. The point of seeing sin is to run back to the cross so that we can glory in our salvation. My sinful nature is alive and well and will be until the day I die. But that's not what defines me. I'm a child of the King, bought by blood, adopted into his family. And I look in the dark corners from that perspective, from the perspective of being one who is loved by God, accepted by God. As Yancey says, there's nothing that I can do today to make God love me more. And there's nothing I can do today to make God love me less. So I hope that helps just round off that. Oh, I do have my glass. I was thinking, where are my glasses? Sorry. Senior moment. How to stay in leadership without losing your joy. The verse that Henrik read at the beginning of the last session, what's your life? In some senses, that's what I want us to think about. And one of the things that I've ended up doing in IFES is doing some stuff on work-life balance. And so some of the practical stuff at the end will come from that perspective. But to set the scene a little bit from Galatians, first of all. You know that from the most basic scan of Galatians that Paul is really annoyed, really frustrated with the church at Galatia. His concern is that a different gospel is being preached. And he's basically saying there only is one gospel. There isn't another gospel. So let's read a couple of verses from the beginning of Galatians chapter 1. And we'll read from verses 6 to 9. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if an angel from heaven, even if we were, or an angel from heaven, should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let him be eternally condemned. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel other than the one you accepted, let him be eternally condemned. Now, we're not going to do an exposition of Galatians, but notice the words and phrases that he uses here. He says he's astonished. He's astonished that they're quickly deserting. He's astonished that they're following this different gospel. He's astonished that they have been thrown into confusion. He's astonished that they are trying to pervert the gospel, which is no gospel at all. What were the Galatians doing? It sounds like they were doing some really terribly bad stuff. When in actual fact, the question that they were Paul was wanting them to answer was, is the gospel about grace or is it about keeping the rules? And the Galatians thought it was about both, and I think sometimes so do we. When he goes on to chapter 3, he starts at the beginning of chapter 3 by saying, "Foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by observing the law or by believing what you had heard?" That's what we were talking about in the last session. Believing, not on the basis of performance. Did you receive the Spirit by observing the law or by believing what you had heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning with the Spirit, are you now trying to attain your goal by human effort? Foolish Galatians. You've begun in the Spirit, you're now trying to be made perfect by human effort. And then in 4:15, I don't know what word is used here. The translations vary, but in my version of the NIV, 4:15 says, "What has happened to all your joy?" And I'm choosing to keep with that translation because it helps my talk. That's bad exegesis, but it helps my talk at this point. What has happened to all your joy? My understanding of Greek could be put in that folded in about 8, so I don't know what it says in Greek. What has happened to all your joy? And one of the things that has come out of this clearly is that for the Galatians, whatever it is they're doing, it has impacted their passion, it has impacted their joy, it has impacted their relationship with Jesus. So, to repeat what I've already said, a significant part of holding on to joy in the long run is to believe the gospel. Holding on to joy means, at least in part, believing the gospel. Joy is not the same as happiness. Joy is a deep-seated, inside-out contentment and passion that comes from a clear understanding of who we are as children of the King. It obviously includes happiness, but there are days when we can be content and enjoying, joyful, even though the circumstances are tough. So a significant part of what it means to hold on to joy in the long run is to believe the gospel. That's hardly profound, but we can't ignore it. And as I've already said, we need to continually preach the gospel to ourselves. We need to believe the truth. We don't believe the lie. We don't allow the evil one, we don't allow the world, we don't allow our own sinful nature to undermine and tell us lies. Because it is so easy for us, our heart is deceitful, and it's so easy for us to believe the wrong stuff. Don't believe what I just said there at the beginning in terms of being adopted into his family. When you think of staying the course in the long term without losing your joy, can you think of some of the things that may cause you to lose your joy? I'm 65 at this stage. Retirement age in Ireland is 66. So I'm standing down from the church next year. I'm still hoping to stay on with IFES for a while. But I suppose what I'm saying is I've been at this a long time. And Lord willing, I'm not finished yet. But how do we, as we look, for some of you looking forward to another 40 years in ministry, for some of you like me, a lot less. But what are some of the things that cause you to lose your joy? That was not a rhetorical question. So being discouraged by other people wandering off. Okay, yeah. Anything else? Yep. Okay. Feeling like you're grinding it out and nothing's changing, nothing's happening. Okay. Sorry, I'm supposed to be repeating. Did you hear that? Okay, sorry. Not seeing any fruit was that one. Yeah. Anything else? Yep.
When rules are given more focus than life.
Okay. Yeah. When rules are given more focus than life, it is very easy for churches and organizations to just become hardened. Igor Zrautmanis from Latvia, one of my IFES Europe colleagues, says it's very easy for movements to become monuments. Does that word monument, is that okay? Yeah. When someone dies, we celebrate them by putting up a statue. But there's not a lot of life in a statue. So it's very easy for movements to become monuments. I don't know hardly anything at all about the mission organization that is putting this on, but I do know that in the Nordic countries, and I understand that this is true here, that many of these movements have come out of revival movements in the past. And that's the danger, that you look back. A number of you are younger, so this may not be true for you, but for some of your supporters, it may be that they're looking back to the good old days. It's looking back to the days when. We need to be careful with that. As I said earlier, I know most of you are Lutherans, so I don't want to introduce too much Presbyterian stuff here, but my background is Presbyterian. But one of the phrases that in the Reformed Church that is talked about, Reformed Church always reforming. It's not. The danger is that you take a position and you stand, and there's no transformation, there's no change, and there needs to be ongoing transformation and change. Sorry, you didn't need a sermon off the back of a comment, but anything else? You've forgotten what the question is now, isn't that right? Things that cause you to lose your joy. I mean, I think some of the things that have been said are definitely in there. It is very difficult if we're in a situation where there's no encouragement at all, where there's no change. Things just seem to be just dragging on. It's very difficult if we see friends of ours. And one of the challenges, for those of you who are younger, as you grew up, and this is part of the reason for the topic, it's not about starting well. It's about finishing well. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon. Is it possible to turn that off for a second? The video off for a second? I want to tell an illustration, but I don't want it recorded. Is that possible? Sorry. Sorry for the interruption. You guys who are watching on film, tough that you didn't hear the illustration, but you're not hearing it now. Okay. The danger of no encouragement. For some of you, joy can be lost because you're in the wrong job. You're in the wrong place. Your gifts and the job don't match. Some of you have lost your joy because you've been doing the job you've been doing for too long. And it has now become duty. It's now become rote. Some of you have lost your joy because you've spent so much time and energy focusing on your ministry that your marriage and your family is now a shell. Hollow. You may still be married, but the marriage has died. And you may only be discovering that as your children leave home. And you discover that there's no conversation now that there's nobody there to have conversation with. You've discovered that there's no conversation now that you don't have to say who's taking the kids swimming and whose turn is it to do the school run, and can you sign this form for school or whatever it is. And for some of you, joy has gone because everything has been poured into ministry and the marriage is empty. Some of you have lost your joy because of discouragements and disagreements and arguments and conflict with colleagues. I'm going to get this statistic wrong, but the number doesn't actually matter. But I remember hearing that for overseas missionaries, I think it's something between 2/3 and 3/4 of those who return after one term return because of difficulties and conflict with colleagues. For some of you, you've lost your joy because you're overwhelmed and overtired. We can't address all of these issues, but just a brief stock take. Again, the verse that Henrik read, "Watch your life." In Acts 20 and 28, Paul says to the Ephesian elders, Acts 20 and verse 28, and he says, "Keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers." We want those that we work with to grow and develop during their time with us, whether it's people in the congregation or whether it's staff in the organization. We don't want to treat people like paper tissue, which we use and then just simply throw away. People are your most valuable resource in your church, in your organization, in your movement. But we need to think about how we're caring for them, and one of the ways that we care for them is also to care for ourselves. You already know what I'm going to say in this next section, but it still needs to be said. The work is bigger than you. The work is bigger than you. You are simply stewards. And for a short time, the baton, I'm mixing my metaphors, but the baton has been passed to you. For a short time, the baton has been passed to you. This may come as a shock to some of you, but you are dispensable. You are dispensable. I don't know if any of you are interested in rugby. I don't know if any of you even understand the sport of rugby. But nearly 2 weeks ago, Ireland beat the New Zealand All Blacks in Chicago for the first time in 111 years. After 29 attempts, and off the back of a world record run of wins by the All Blacks, when they had won 18 games in a row. They had beaten everybody for the last 18 games. Ireland were not expected to win, and they won. I am here, I want you to know, at great cost, because the return match is in Dublin tomorrow afternoon. And what I am dreading is that the pilot, as we're coming into land, will explain the score before I get home and watch it on record. But the Irish players, there's a great team spirit. And this is not just true of Irish rugby, but it's true of many sports. But the Irish players talk about not owning the jersey, not owning the shirt. The shirt has been given to them for a short time. They're just borrowing the shirt. Do you understand that illustration? So for you, you're just borrowing the shirt. It has been passed on to you for a short time. My Mum spent quite a long time in a nursing home before she died about 10 years ago when she was 93, I think. And somebody, I should have looked this, I'm off-piste at this point, sorry. I should have looked this up before I thought about saying it, but somebody had given her a little verse. And it says something, it's from the Psalms, says something along this line. Lord, even when I'm old and gray, let me not forsake you until I've passed the good news on to the next generation. That's my paraphrase, but I think it's maybe 78 or someplace around there. But even when I'm old and gray, don't forsake me until I pass the good news to the next generation. And that's what we're called to do, to be passing the good news on to the next generation. Because we only have the jersey for a short time. And that's critical in terms of us maintaining our joy. For those of you who are older, whatever you think about the coming generations, the baton is passing to them. I don't care how hard you hold it onto it. I don't care how tight you hold onto it. The baton is passing to them. And if you don't give it to them, it'll drop and they'll either pick it up or not. But one way or another, you're not going to be holding on to it because you only have the jersey for a short time. And that helps us in terms of maintaining our joy, because we need to remember, whose work is it anyway? Whose work is it anyway? The job is never finished. It will never be finished until Jesus comes back. And if you take that burden on you, it will crush you. It will kill you. Don't know if any of you know the name of Robert Murray McCheyne. He was a Scottish preacher who died in 1843. And he died at the age of 29. And his last words apparently were, Lord, you gave me a message and you gave me a horse, his body. And I've killed the horse. And now I can't deliver the message. At 29. Whose work is it anyway? It's not your work. Again, this may be news to some of you, but you're not the Savior. Do you hear me? You're not the Savior. I know you know that theologically. But do you live with a different perspective? Jack Miller, who was the founder of the mission that this diagram came out of, was a professor in Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. And he said there are only two spiritual laws. One, God exists. Two, you're not him. Again, that helps us to maintain our joy. And for the rest of the time, what I want us to focus on is trying to help us think about what it means to live integrated lives, lives that make sense, lives that hold together. Helping us to remember that everything we do is under the control of Christ the King. I'm not going to stray into this because I'm saying a little bit about it tomorrow. But we need to know, in the middle of all that's going on around us today, all of the confusion and the mess and the fear that some people feel, including some followers of Jesus, we need to remember that there is a king behind the king. IS are not going to win. Donald Trump is not going to rule the world. We know that there's a king behind the king. And we know that King Jesus wins. So we need to keep that in perspective in all that we're doing. and recognize our part in that big story, and recognize that God has included us in his story. But that gives us perspective and enables us to play our part without feeling the weight or the burden or the overwhelming nature of what could easily destroy us and crush us. Verses you know well from Matthew chapter 11, 28 to 30. Matthew 11, 28 to 30. Matthew 11, 28 to 30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And we're called to take his yoke, that yoke that fits perfectly. You know that the picture is the yoke across a pair of oxen, the yoke that fits perfectly. The call to walk in partnership with him for the rest of our lives. And the yoke is a yoke of love. It's not a yoke of duty. The yoke is like a wedding ring. It's a promise. It's a promise to walk with him, walk alongside him for the rest of our lives. There's a great quote from Michael Green on his commentary on this passage. This walking with him, taking his yoke upon us. He says, it is the response of the liberated, not the duty of the obligated. Okay, sorry, I recognize in a second language that may not work, but it's the response of the liberated. We do this freely, we choose. It's not the duty of the obligated. And if we're living out of that joy and that joy of the gospel and the transformation that grace brings, then that feels and smells very different to us and to everybody around us than duty and obligation. Guilt and pointing fingers are very short-term motivators. As I said earlier, it's easy for us to lose sight of the gospel, just like the Galatians. And we live life in practical isolation, feeling like it all depends on us. Living like orphans, living as if we don't have a heavenly Father. Living, saying the words, but no music. Again, from the last session, Galatians 5:1, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. I know that you believe that, but is that what it feels like? I mentioned Jack Miller earlier, and one of his colleagues from the seminary there, a guy called Claire Davies. I heard this quote only a couple of weeks ago. And I hope you're able to hear the quote without being offended by it, because there may be some of you who have friends or family who are struggling with Alzheimer's, so I hope that the quote doesn't cause you pain. But what this guy, Claire Davies, says is that with grace, I have Alzheimer's deja vu. With grace, I have Alzheimer's deja vu. I find myself saying, when I rediscover grace, oh, I think I remember having forgotten this before. I'll say that again. Oh, I think I remember having forgotten this before. And that's part of the challenge for us. We need to keep remembering that we're living out of grace. We need to keep grace central. We need to keep our hearts soft. And that's especially true as we get older. We need to keep our hearts soft in order that that process of ongoing transformation will be up front and central. And as that happens, that ongoing transformation, ongoing refreshment should bring joy. You will notice that in the last session and in this session, I haven't given you a whole bunch of to-do lists, because it's about a changed heart, not just changed behavior. And if your heart has changed, your behavior will change. And I could give you things that will be behavior modification things, but they're not going to make a difference in the long term, because you need to be changed from the inside out. I want to move on to some of the personal stuff in just a moment, but a couple of words about community first of all. If you're isolated from the community of faith, you're very vulnerable. I said in the last session that one of the dangers for people in ministry is that they don't be open and honest with the people that they're leading, because they feel they have to present an image. They have to, even positively, they want to be a good model. But being a good model by never sharing the struggles that we have is not being a good model. And if you're isolated from community of faith, it can make you very, very vulnerable. Henri Nouwen said this. Leadership is often exercised by people who do not know how to develop healthy, intimate relationships and have opted for power and control instead. Many of these people are unable to give and receive love. Leadership is often exercised by people who do not know how to develop healthy, intimate relationships and have opted for power and control instead. Many of these people are unable to give and receive love. Be careful if you're isolated. I don't know how many of you are senior pastors. I don't know how many of you are senior leaders at whatever level. But be careful that you're not isolated from the community of faith, because it leaves you vulnerable. I want to argue for collegial leadership, no matter how small the team. I want to argue for that because the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I want to argue for it because we're made for community. We're made to help each other. We're made to be together. It provides accountability structures that keeps us from being more vulnerable. Being part of a collegial leadership also helps you not to take yourself too seriously. Because if you don't learn to laugh at yourself, then somebody else will be laughing at you. And there's real benefit in learning to laugh at yourself and not take yourself too seriously. Collegial leadership should mean that there is somebody asking you the hard questions. I talked earlier just a little bit about the struggle that Hazel and I had in our marriage. And when we began to explain some of the challenges, when we began to talk about what was going on, no one in the church came to me and said, Cassells, you're being much too hard on yourself. You weren't like that. You weren't as bad as that. Nobody said that. Because everybody saw. Everybody knew. Everybody smelt my self-righteous, arrogant Pharisee heart. But nobody said. Because sometimes in Christian ministry, I don't ask you hard questions. Because I don't want you to ask me hard questions. And there's a silent conspiracy. And if we're involved in leadership, we need to try and break that down. And one of the ways that we can break that down is by us disclosing. Don't expect the other person to disclose if we're not willing to disclose. I'm sure there's lots more could be said there. This last section, just a little bit then. You can, sure. Am I dropping? Okay, thank you. No, go ahead, sorry. I think, yeah, just a couple of suggestions, and I don't know where you are in terms of your life, so these questions may not relate to you, but ask questions about how things are in your marriage, where you are in your relationship. I'm going to talk in a moment or two about where the cracks are for each of us, and other people need to know where the cracks are so that they can be asking us questions into those areas. So come back to me if it doesn't make sense in a moment or two. Is that okay? Okay. So just a few things in this last bit about how to balance life and ministry without burning out, without giving up, how we keep going to the end with joy. What's balance going to look like? I hope from what I've said already that you understand that part of it at least is it's about being, not just doing. We recognize that we have to cope with complex choices. I'll say a little bit more about that in the seminar tomorrow. It means coping with stress and pressure. How do we do that? So, for example, how well do you know yourself? What energizes you? These are rhetorical questions at this point, so just things for you to reflect on. What energizes you? What drains you? What relaxes you? How do you normally deal with stress? God in His mercy has given me something that I have found really helpful over the years. When I get overtired and stressed, I get a tick in this eye. So my eye begins to flicker. It feels like it's going beep, 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 but you can barely see it. Do you understand what I mean by a tick? Yeah? And I used to find it very frustrating, whereas now I realize it's a stress trigger. I realize this is something that God has given me to say, beep, 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 slow down, pay attention. What's the stress trigger for you? Are there things that you notice? Are any of you susceptible to migraine? I have supervised staff over the years, and for many of them who have struggled with migraine comes on their day off. It comes on their holiday. It comes when they begin to relax. It probably means that you're under pressure, you're going too hard. I had a woman colleague who for several years had flu every February. She worked too hard through the first academic term with students. She didn't have adequate break at Christmas. She started back into the second term and fell apart quickly. And I remember after a couple of years talking to her about that and saying, do you remember you had flu this time last year and you had flu this time the year before? And saying, I don't think it's flu, I think it's exhaustion. And I've lost touch with her a bit now, but for the rest of the time we worked together, she didn't have flu in February again because she began to recognize she was calling it by the wrong name and she needed to think about how to mind herself better. Do you know your limits? Not all of you will be able to work in the same way. I recognize that in the Nordic countries you have some things in place that are better than some other parts of Europe. And government and requirements mean that probably some of you are not doing crazy hours the way some other staff and IFES movements are doing. But do you live too close to the edge? If this is the edge, and you live all your life here Then when the washing machine floods, or you have a flat tire, or that guy cuts in the front of you so that you miss the lights, and those things put you over the edge. If the broken washing machine puts you over the edge, if the flat tire puts you over the edge, if the person cutting in front of you puts you over the edge, you're living too close to the edge. Does that make sense? So you need to back up a bit so that you can cope with the normal and natural stresses of life, the things that happen, the person who told you they would do that job for you by the deadline. You need to be able to cope with that because they will let you down sometimes. But if you're right on the edge, if you're right on the wire, then you're likely to just go over the edge. So do you know your limits, and are you living within your limits so that you're not living too close to the edge? Does that make sense? Okay. Are you able to identify what is real rather than what is just image and reputation? We worked in a conference center for 5.5 years. We ran a conference center. And when we moved there, our older son was less than 2, and our second child was 2 weeks old. We were told that we would have a cook. We didn't. And so about 6 weeks after that, Hazel, who had no experience as a cook, began to cook for conferences. It wasn't a big conference center, but we were still cooking 40, 50, sometimes 60 people. And so for the first 4 months of his life, our second son, his long sleep was from 6 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the afternoon so that Hazel could cook breakfast and cook lunch. It nearly destroyed us. It nearly killed her. Hazel nearly had a breakdown. And people said to us, we don't know how you do this. We don't know how you cope with this level of work. And so we thought, we're wonderful. And so we kept going. And until we began to put our hands up and say, we're not coping, we're not managing, we can't do this, we didn't begin to get a better perspective. So we were impressed by other people's comments, and we were so concerned about our image and reputation that we weren't willing and able to say, we're not coping. We've already spoken about this, but we need to be careful about dissonance. We need to be careful about the inside and the outside. We need to be careful about who we are in public and who we are in private. None of us are exactly the same in public and private, but the bigger the dissonance, the bigger the distance between public and private, the more likelihood of distress and disease. If you're faking it in public, the chances are people are suffering in private. And the danger of breakdown, real physical, emotional, mental breakdown, is significant if that keeps going. Know your circumstances as well as knowing yourself. Know your circumstances. Your life circumstances will change from time to time. Our oldest son at this point is an assistant pastor in a church in Wexford. Their oldest child is 4 and 2 months. Their next child is will be 3 in February. This is going on tape, and I'm not remembering their dates. This is not going well. And their youngest child was born in July. So they have 3 children, basically under 4. They need to understand their life circumstances at that point. If some of you are in a place like that, be sensible, be wise. When our kids were younger, this may not translate. I'm off-piste again, but anyway, this may not translate. But when I was at the beginning of the student work, the Irish student movement was also part of the British student movement. And so we went over to staff conferences in Britain. The movement was much bigger. Hazel sometimes came to those conferences, We had 4 kids within 6 years. Now, that wasn't the student movement's fault. We were responsible for that ourselves. But Hazel would go to the staff conferences and she would meet these young, earnest seminary students and theological students and staff workers. And they would say to her, what sort of area are you reading in at this stage? And she would say, I can't remember the title, but as far as I remember, Postman Pat was in it. Do you know Postman Pat? Whatever, Peppa Pig, whatever the equivalent is here. Because she was spending all her time with kids. What is realistic at this stage in your life? Know when you need help. If you're over-emotional and easily go to tears or anger, know that you need help. Or the opposite side, if you're flatlining, you know, in the medical programs, beep, beep, beep. When the green line goes flat, you're not in good shape. So if you're emotionally flatlining, recognize the implications of that. What about your eating and sleeping patterns? If you're under stress, do you comfort eat? If you're under stress, do you starve yourself? When I'm under pressure, I'm a good sleeper. I sleep well nearly all the time. But when I'm under pressure, I dream. And my dreams include some version of catching a train or a bus or a plane or whatever. And with each passing day, the train is further up the platform and I'm running longer and harder before I get to it. And again, I know that is a stress trigger for me. I know I'm under pressure when those recurrent dreams start to happen because I know it's highlighting something else. How are you first thing in the morning? I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so please, this is a blunt instrument for fellow travelers who are not professionals. How are you first thing in the morning? If your blackest period is first thing in the morning, if the blackest time is first thing in the morning, be careful, because that's a symptom, potential symptom of clinical depression. If your blackest time, if you struggle to get out of bed in the morning, you need to go and get help. Where do you get help? What do you do in terms of physical fitness? What do you do in terms of health checkups? I have chosen, because of Hazel's encouragement and insistence over the last 15 years, to go to the doctor once a year for a full medical. You know, this is definitely too much information to go on film, but you know how many men struggle to go to the doctor. You know the number of men who are dying of prostate cancer because they don't go to the doctor. It's not pleasant, but it's better than dying. Are you getting proper physical checks? Where are the cracks for you? Billy Graham talked about power, sex, and money. You can add a number of things to that, like substance abuse, whether that substance is food or alcohol or drugs. But where are the cracks for you? Do you know where the cracks are for you? The cracks are unlikely to change. Again, I recognize this is going on tape, but we'll just keep going. I know for me, alcohol is not a particular challenge. I enjoy a glass of wine, I enjoy a glass of cider, but I don't like alcohol well enough for it to become an issue. But every trip I do, I need to be careful in terms of the whole sexual area. Who am I when nobody's watching? Who am I when I go through airports or occasionally stay in places where nobody else knows that I'm there? Some of you are thinking, you're 65, you should be past that. I know that's where the crack is for me. And I keep short accounts with Hazel. If I'm under pressure there, I talk to her. If there are incidents on travel, I talk to her as soon as I get home. Where are the cracks for you? In a group this size, I expect that some of you are addicted to pornography. I expect that some of you struggle with substance abuse of some sort. I expect that some of you are struggling with image and identity, potentially body image and identity. This group of people who are coming tonight, you know that some of these young people are self-harming. You know that some of them are struggling with bulimia and anorexia. You know that some of them are struggling with pornography. But you're foolish if you think they're only in the hall next door. And they're not here as well. People, we need to help each other. We need to know where the cracks are. You need to know where the cracks are for you, because you know that that's where the evil one will attack you. And you know if there's a crack for you, one of the times when that crack will be exposed will be Sunday night and Monday morning after a busy weekend like this. So wherever the crack is for you, you know that the evil one will be out to attack you as soon as you go home. Because you're tired. Hopefully there'll be a positive buzz and good teaching and a good weekend to come. But watch out for the cracks on Sunday night and Monday. Watch out for those of you who are inclined to be harsh and judgmental and angry with your spouses. Because again, it's very easy for that to happen off the back of really good ministry opportunities. One of the questions that we were asked to ask as part of this process, and I was asked to ask because I was the one that talked and didn't listen. What's it like to live with me? So can I encourage you to ask your spouse or your significant other, people who are around you, what's it like to live with me? And then to begin to listen. I'm just going to say this now in case I forget. I don't know